Hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry. Today I am going to be once again trying to go for an explanation of how citadels work in this game. Because I figured, if you don't make these videos from time to time, people forget about it, or new people come on who never see the old ones. And I'll try to keep it simple as much as possible and keep the math out of it as much as I personally enjoy that. So, citadels, armor, shells, and all those things. How do they even work? Let's begin with the armor layout. And contrary to belief, Warships Blitz does have an armor layout. It is simplified compared to, say, PC or Legends, but it is not as trivial. So effectively, you have several armor zones. You've got the forward section, which is everything from the front of the first turret towards the bow. You've got the midsection, which has the main armor belt on it, which is between the first turret and the last turret in the rear. You've got the stern section, which is the rear part. You have the deck armor, which is, well, everything on top of the ship. And you have the superstructure, which is the bits that are sticking out on top of the ship, including the bridge, the funnels, all these little things pointing out. And as modules go, you've got a couple more, like the turrets and such. So these segments of the ship have different armor values. Now, what is a citadel? In very simple terms, it's the bit where all the things go in the ship that really react badly to being shot at, like magazines. So the things that you really want to protect the most from going boom. And that's why in Warships Blitz, if you hit the Citadel and you score a Citadel hit, which means that the shell, in nautical terms, the shell goes into the important bits, blows up there and does extreme damage. The Citadel is a box between the beginning of the first turret and the end of the last turret. Everything in the middle between those two, that's the Citadel. You can really think of it as a box, a rectangular box. Now, the armor zones are from thinnest to thickest. The thinnest armor you generally find on the bow and stern, and potentially the superstructure. Then the deck armor tends to be thicker than that, and the side belt armor tends to be the thickest. You can sort of see it in the model here. If you glint a little bit at the side, there's a long straight armor plate, which is the bit that protects all the vitals from the side. So we've got thick armor on the belt, thinner armor on the deck, and the thinnest armor generally around bow, stern, superstructure. Why does this matter? Well, this matters if we look at penetration mechanics. And for that, we can literally just, where do we have it for combat? There we go, AP and HE shells. So, as you can see, armor-piercing shells have 4 types of impact. They can penetrate, which means it goes through the armor and goes kaboom. It can semi-penetrate, which means it goes to the armor a little bit and goes kaboom, and only does 50% of damage. It can over-penetrate, which means it goes all the way through the ship, and the fuse doesn't arm, which does 25% of damage. And it can bounce off the armor and do no damage whatsoever. So, how do citadels work? In simple terms, or the ground rule for it is you need a full penetration in the central section that we just discussed. And you need to pass a dice roll in order for the citadel to happen. So if we look back at the ship, if you manage to get a full penetration in the central citadel hitbox, and that can either be through the deck armor or through the main belt armor, then there is a chance that your shell will score a citadel hit. Now, remember what I just said, the belt armor is thicker than the deck armor, which means it is generally easier to get a citadel hit through the deck armor, especially with larger caliber guns, or with smaller ones even, because the belt is thick, and the thicker the armor, the harder it is to get through. how do you actually get through the armor? Well, glad that you asked. So let's go back to the wiki. And armor-piercing shells have a penetration value. So when the shell leaves the barrel, and by the way, most of this is inferred from experience and glimpses that we had behind the scenes. None of this is official, just mentioning it for completeness sake here. A shell has a penetration value when it leaves the barrel, presumably in millimeters of armor that it can get through. So this penetration value gets reduced over time. In fact, there is actually a captain skill. So if we look here at the armor-piercing cap shell, it says it increases the maximum penetration. So let's say your shell, when it leaves the barrel of your gun, has a penetration of 100 millimeter. With the APCS skill, it has a penetration of 105 millimeters when it leaves the gun. And it improves the penetration power sustainability. So as the shell flies, the further it flies, the less armor it can get through. And until it actually impacts, and at that point, the game checks how much penetration does the shell have remaining from its initial value minus whatever it lost during the flight time, and how thick is the armor at the time. And there's probably some form of random value in there as well. And then it decides if you managed to get a full penetration, which you need in order to get the Citadel throw. We do know for some older ships, if you look at the CIC website, there are some values that have been data mined for the older ships on the chance of scoring Citadel hits. The general rule of thumb is the bigger the gun, the higher the chance, and that's the dice roll. So you need two things. You need a full penetration against the Citadel hitbox, and you need to pass the dice roll. There's one exception, or one special rule, and that's for German battleships from tier 7 and up. So for those, if you manage to get through, you need to pass a second penetration test. They have a special mechanic that sort of allows them to not get citadeled as easily. And they are already the most heavily armored ships, at least the battleships, not the battle cruisers. So if you look at the Ghost of Kurfürst, at least from what we can see, she has the greatest protection values here. And these ships have a second check, penetration check, before the Citadel roll happens, in order to make sure that they can sustain fire more easily. That doesn't mean you can't Citadel them, it's just harder. How does this work for, let's say, small shells? So if I only have 150 millimeter guns, well, you have two values that are reduced. You've got less penetration power to start with. So if I'm, for example, I am going to look at, an American cruiser. So if I look at a Cleveland has 150 millimeter guns. Does that mean she can Citadel ships? Yes, absolutely. As long as you fire armor piercing. These guns also have a lower initial penetration, and depending on where you hit the enemy ship, you will be needing a full penetration, plus you need to actually roll the dice to match the Citadel factor, and then you get a Citadel. Get against a battleship side armor, these 150 millimeter shells are not going to get through. The damage over time, or the penetration over time reduction, means that the closer you are, the easier it is to get through, because your shells don't have to fly that far, which means they don't lose as much penetration. So being closer makes it easier to Citadel things. You may be able to get through the deck armor of things, and that's really where it just comes down to experience and seeing where, knowing your target and seeing where it's most vulnerable. How much damage are you going to do with a Citadel? Well, again, that depends on the shell caliber. So with a smaller gun, like a 150 millimeter gun on light cruisers, you will do 150% of damage, which means that instead of the 566, you're going to do about 700 in a cookie. And there's still the damage reduction and everything coming into play. With larger guns, so for example, if we look at the if we look at large battleships, let's do that. So an Izumo with 400mm guns, or 410mm main guns, will do 250% Citadel damage, whereas Yamato caliber and above, so Ohio, Vermont, Shikishima, Incomparable, these sort of guns, they do 300% Citadel damage, so triple, which means that something like a Shikishima can do even 350% of damage and can score something like 10,000 points of damage on a Citadel, which is quite ridiculous. But in return, these ships have other factors to balance them out. So the bigger your gun, the more penetration you have. The closer you are to the target, the more penetration you have. The weaker the armor that you're hitting, the more chance you have to get that full penetration. And generally also the bigger the gun, the higher the chance of actually scoring a Citadel hit. But it's still usually around 12-13%-ish of a chance. What does that mean in practice? So what should you do? Well, there are a couple of factors. The first thing, especially if you're shooting at long range, hitting the belt armor of an enemy ship is actually not quite effective. So this is where Warships Blitz is very different from, say, Warships PC, where if you give a broadside and armor angle matters, which it doesn't here, if you're giving a broadside and you're taking a hit at the armor belt, it might well go through and score a Citadel. Whereas if you're angled away in PC, not in Blitz, or in Legends, then you're increasing the armor thickness and it's a higher chance that the thing bounces off. In Blitz, that's not so much the case. That doesn't mean you should just be sitting on broadside, because you're just giving the enemy more ship to shoot at. But generally, if you're being hit on the belt, it can be quite hard for a shell, especially at longer ranges, to actually score a full penetration, which is why most people will try to aim for the deck armor. Because the deck armor is thinner, and if you can manage to hit the deck armor, there's a higher chance to get a full penetration. And if there is a higher chance to get a full penetration, then there's also a higher chance to actually pass the Citadel roll and score one or multiple Citadels. The other thing that matters to a degree is the number of guns. So let's compare, for example, the Shikishima and the Vermont. The Shikishima has 6 guns. The Vermont has 12 guns. The Vermont's guns are big. These are almost Yamato caliber guns, 457mm. These guns are quite punchy. But you have 12 shells that can make a full penetration and 12 chances to pass the Citadel roll. Whereas on something like a Shikishima, you only have half the shells hitting the target, and only if you manage to get 6 full penetrations, you only get 6 rolls of the dice to see if one of them becomes a Citadel. And that means potentially fewer Citadels. Now there are many more factors, of course. Like I said, there's distance, there's initial penetration, and there's also the actual gun. Right, so there's some ships that are pretty infamous, like the Slava. Now the Slava, for example, only has 406mm guns, but these guns have an insane initial penetration. Well, we don't know that exactly, but that's the assumption, because the Slava can Citadel the absolute crap out of things, despite only having 400mm guns. And that's presumably because A, these guns are very accurate and you can get them on target, and B, they have this very high initial value or very low penetration loss over time factor. That means that when they hit, they actually get through a lot of things. And again, you need full penetrations for this to happen. So the last thing we're going to touch is manual aiming. Why does manual aiming matter? Like I said, you want to avoid hitting the belt armor. And one of the rolling theories, and that one goes to slide 47 here, is that the lock-on, or auto-aim if you want, pulls the shells towards the center of the ship, where there is the belt armor. So depending on how much of that happens, depending on where the actual center of mass on a ship is, you may or may not have more trouble actually getting past the belt armor and hitting the other bits, mainly the deck armor, for a better chance of penetration. But it can also, it's a two-edged sword personally, especially at long ranges. I find it very difficult to get reliable hits in. And again, it's a game of chance. So there are many factors in here, not just where you aim. But if you want to score a Citadel, where you want to aim is the central box. So hit an enemy ship, preferably at the deck armor, from between the first turret and the last turret. Now, there are a couple of exceptions here. 2 of them, in fact. One of them being destroyers. So let's look at the gearing. These ships have 4 armor zones. They have the bow, stern, side armor, and deck and superstructure and everything else, just like other ships. But they don't have a citadel. Now, there are odd reports of ships actually getting citadel, or destroyers getting citadel. Flukes, bugs, we don't know. But it happens occasionally, but very rarely. Mostly you will not score citadels on destroyers. So even if you manage to get a full penetration, even if you have a very good chance of scoring citadels, if you're doing it on a destroyer, it's not really going to happen. And the armor on destroyers is generally very thin, which means it's often easier to overpenetrate destroyers. The other difference is with aircraft carriers. So again, we don't know that for sure, but aircraft carriers, at least in my understanding and from what I've been trying around, most of their hangar deck seems to be counting a citadel. So you can sort of score citadels pretty much everywhere on these things. Which it means it is generally quite easy to score citadels because A, they're not particularly well armored, B, which means you get more full penetrations, and they don't seem to be having necessarily the same size of relatively small center hitbox. So, and they don't have a lot of belt armor that you can get through, so there's a lot of things you can do about aircraft carriers, which means if you're in an aircraft carrier, you don't want to get in a gunfight, which is pretty obvious. So the last thing we're going to check today, what about the other shells? So if we look at combat, and we've got high explosive shells. Can high explosive shells score citadels? Yes, they can. It isn't mentioned explicitly anywhere, but they can absolutely. So if you have a high explosive shells don't seem to be losing penetration power, or maybe it's just never mentioned because the relevant captain skill just mentions the overall penetration, but not the loss of penetration power over time. And here it doesn't say, right? It says the penetration power decreases as they travel through the air for armor-piercing shells, but it does not say the same for high explosive shells. So assuming that that's not the case here, high explosive shells have a much lower penetration overall, which means it is much, much harder for them to score citadels. That doesn't mean that you can't, especially with things like British battleships. You can occasionally manage to score citadels. Semi-armor piercing shells, it doesn't say anything about losing power over time. So it just mentions that they don't overpenetrate, which is incorrect. They do very occasionally. I've seen SAP shells overpenetrating, but assuming that these are bugs or edge conditions that are edge cases that cause this, mostly they don't. So they can still penetrate, and they can still totally score citadels as well. So the same factor remains again. That also is true for semi-armor piercing shells. So there you go, citadels and the ways it works in World of Warships Blitz. Again, for all statistics, either data mined or otherwise determined, I'll refer you to the excellent CIC website if you want to get an idea of it. But the general basic rules are: if you're shooting at anything except destroyers, try to aim for the deck armor between the first and the last gun. That's your best chance of getting full penetrations and your best chance of getting citadels. For anything below 200 millimeter, it doesn't matter a huge amount because your citadel chance isn't that great and your penetration isn't that great, but you can still go for it. But also the citadel factor isn't that great. For anything above that, it starts making a big difference. And for ships like the Shikishima, it makes all the difference, because that 350% citadel damage rate is really where the meat of the damage is in these kind of ships with very few guns. So there you have it. And that's it for me today. Thanks everybody, and I will see you next time. Bye bye.